The morning the Earl of Ashwick arrived at Thornfield House, Nora Vane was on her hands and knees in the entrance hall, pressing a cloth against the grout between the stone tiles, because the housekeeper, Mrs. Gage, had decided the floor was not clean enough for company. She heard the wheels before she heard anything else. The particular crunch of a well-sprung carriage on frozen gravel, the sound of money moving at speed toward a house where money had been scarce for 3 years. Nora sat back on her heels, tucked the cloth into her apron pocket, and did not look toward the door, because she had learned, in 14 months of service at Thornfield House, that looking toward the door when a caller arrived was not her function. She had been a solicitor's daughter once. She had sat in a drawing room in Ipswich and taken tea from a china service and read Cowper in the afternoon light, and no one had told her where to look or when to stop looking. That life had ended with her father's debts, with a letter from the family's creditor, with a morning she could not yet think about without her hands going still. She rose, smoothed her apron, and moved toward the servants' corridor. The door opened behind her. Cold November air came in with the footsteps, and then a voice. "Where is Lord Aldermere?" The voice fell across the entrance hall and stopped Nora's feet before her mind had fully measured it. Low, unhurried, each word placed with the particular precision of a man accustomed to being answered rather than to asking twice. She did not turn. Her hand found the wall at the corridor's edge. She knew that voice. She had last heard it in a different entrance hall, in a different house, 18 months ago. She had been standing then, as she stood now, near a wall, not quite visible to the men in the center of the room. She had heard the voice say it, with precisely that same unhurried certainty. "She cannot remain here. Dispose of the matter accordingly." He did not see her. He had not seen her then, either. Nora walked through the corridor and did not look back, and her hands did not shake until she was in the scullery, alone, with the sound of that voice still settling through her like cold water finding its level. She had been the matter disposed of accordingly. Her name had once been Miss Eleanor Vane of Ipswich, daughter to Mr. Clement Vane, solicitor, and she had spent 2 months in the household of Lord Harwell of Suffolk as a paid companion to his elderly mother, before Lord Harwell's heir had arrived from London and surveyed the arrangement and decided she would not do. She had not understood the full architecture of what happened next for several weeks. The letter from Lord Harwell's solicitor, citing a revision to the household's needs. The reference that praised her character, but said nothing useful about her competence. The cold shoulder of the 3 households she had applied to in the weeks that followed, as though some information had preceded her. She had not known then whose voice had ordered it. She knew now. The Earl of Ashwick was 34 years old, a man of the first consequence in the county and in London, and he had, without once looking at her, altered the course of her life with 7 words. She spent the afternoon in the laundry room and told herself it did not matter. Thornfield House in November was a house with too many fireplaces and not enough wood for all of them, which meant the servants' wing was cold in a way that settled into the shoulders and did not leave. Nora's room was on the upper floor of that wing, small and plainly furnished, with a window that looked out over the kitchen garden and a hook on the back of the door where she hung her one good dress. She was not unhappy there, precisely. She was not happy either. She existed in the house with a competence that the housekeeper noticed and the family ignored, and she had made her peace with being ignored because the alternative, in her experience, was worse. Lord Aldermere himself was rarely present. He was a man of 47, widowed, with 2 daughters in the schoolroom and a great deal of business in London that kept him there through most of the season. His sister, Mrs. Frederica Holt, managed the house in his absence with the confident authority of a woman who had been told her entire life that she was the correct person for whatever room she stood in, and she managed it with a particular attention to the domestic staff that took the form of inspection rather than interest. It was Mrs. Holt, who had received the Earl of Ashwick in the drawing room and then sent word through the second housemaid that all senior domestic staff were to present themselves before the family party at supper. Nora had not been told the reason. She had not asked. The supper was for 6. Lord Aldermere had returned from London that afternoon, his carriage arriving 2 hours after the Earl's, and the party also included a Miss Wentworth, of some local standing, and the Earl's traveling companion, a Mr. Fawley, who had the look of a man content to be wherever he was fed. Nora helped serve. She moved between the sideboard and the table, with the practiced invisibility of a servant who had understood early that silence was a form of safety, and she kept her face toward the dishes and her back, as much as possible, toward the Earl's chair. She heard his voice across the table. She heard it ask about the roads north, about a property matter near York, about the prospects of the county's hunting that season. The voice was the same. There was no part of it that sounded as though it had ever been troubled by anything it had asked someone else to do. Mrs. Holt said, across the centerpiece, "We are a small party, without the season's entertainment, Lord Ashwick. I hope Thornfield's table compensates for its quiet." "It does," the Earl said. "My brother keeps an excellent cellar," she said, and glanced at the bottles, and glanced at Nora, who was standing at the sideboard, and said, with the smooth social precision of a woman who had never once doubted her place in any room, "She is new. I am not yet confident in her." The third person, the unnamed pronoun. Nora kept her eyes on the claret and poured it without spilling. She had heard Mrs. Holt say it before, to the cook, 3 weeks past their first introduction. She is capable enough, I suppose, for a girl with no real training. She would hear it again. She had learned to understand it as weather rather than verdict. What she had not expected was the small, arrested pause from the far end of the table. She did not look. She knew only that something had shifted, briefly, in the quality of the Earl's attention. The way a room shifts when a window is opened and then closed again. She left the supper room with the emptied dishes and did not think about it further. It was in the library, 3 days later, that she understood the pause had not been nothing. She was there to replace a depleted basket of coal and to collect a tray that one of the family had apparently abandoned without mentioning to anyone. The library at Thornfield was a room that belonged to another era of the house's history. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, leather spines, a reading table wide enough to serve as a writing desk, and 2 chairs before a fireplace that had been allowed to burn low. She should have been in and out in 4 minutes. She did not expect anyone to be in the room at 8:30 in the morning. The Earl was there. He stood at the window, with his back to her, a letter in his hand. And he did not hear her come in. She moved to the coal basket as quietly as she could. She lifted the new one from her arms, set the empty aside, and turned to collect the tray from the reading table. Her sleeve caught the rim of a small inkwell, which did not fall but tilted, and she steadied it with 2 fingers. And in the act of steadying it, she inadvertently looked up. He had turned. He was watching her. His face was difficult to read from across the room. He was a man whose features held themselves in a particular steady arrangement, a jaw cut with the slight heaviness of someone who had stopped sleeping well some years ago. Gray eyes with the quality of good pewter, not cold exactly, only very settled. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has reminded him of something else, and she held very still while he did it. "You are not the usual girl," he said. "No, my lord. I am one of Lord Aldermere's household staff. I know whose household you are." He set the letter on the windowsill. "What is your name?" she should have said. as she had said to every member of every family she had served. "Vane, my lord. Nora Vane." She said it now, in the same register, the same suppressed plainness, because giving one's name to a lord required no more ceremony than answering any direct question. The name crossed the room and arrived somewhere behind his face, and she watched a very small thing happen there. Not recognition, not guilt. Something more careful than either. His chin lifted by perhaps half an inch. "Vane," he said. "My lord." "How long have you been at Thornfield?" 14 months, my lord." He looked at her for another 3 seconds. Then he looked at the letter on the windowsill, and some calculation she could not name passed through his expression and resolved into nothing she could read. "Attend to your work," he said, and returned to the window. Nora collected the tray, left the coal basket, and removed herself from the library. She told herself in the scullery, scrubbing the breakfast china, that it meant nothing. He had heard a name. A name was not a history. He had no reason to connect one to the other. And even if he had, there was nothing to be done with the connection. She was Vane the housemaid, and he was the Earl of Ashwick. And the distance between them was exactly as wide as it had always been. She was wrong about the meaning. She did not yet know that. If you have ever wanted to see what it looks like when a man begins to understand the cost of something he did without looking at it, stay a little longer. Nora's story is only partway told. The Earl remained at Thornfield for a fortnight. He should, by all ordinary reckoning, have remained invisible to Nora, except at mealtimes and in corridors, which was the natural order of the relationship between a man of his station and a domestic servant at a friend's estate. The natural order did not entirely hold. She saw him twice more in the library, on mornings when she came to lay the fire, and he was already there. On the first occasion he said nothing, and she said nothing, and they occupied the room in the quiet parallel of people who have an agreement they have not named. On the second he said, as she was leaving, "The Cowper you were reading at supper. You set it aside before the soup was cleared." She stopped, turned. He was at the writing desk, not looking at her. "I apologize, my lord. I should not have had it out." "I did not say you should not. I said you set it aside." He looked up then, briefly, and there was something in the look that was closer to questioning than command. "Do you read much in your own time?" "When I can come by a book, my lord." "This library is Lord Aldermere's." "Yes, my lord." A pause. He returned to the desk. "I will not report having seen Cowper on the servant's chair," he said. "If the question arises." Nora left the room. She stood in the passage and pressed her back to the wall and made herself breathe slowly. She did not know what to do with a kindness from him. She was not sure it was kindness exactly. It had the shape of something more uncomfortable than kindness, the shape of a man making small adjustments to the edges of an old account without yet looking at the sum. It was Mrs. Holt who changed the tenor of the fortnight in its second week. She came upon Nora in the upstairs corridor as Nora was carrying fresh linens to the guest rooms, and she stopped, and she looked, and she said, with the particular precision she reserved for servants, she found threatening without being able to name why, "You have been spending time near Lord Ashwick's rooms." "I attend to all the guest rooms on this corridor, Mrs. Holt." "Quite." A pause, perfectly calibrated. "You are attentive to your work." "I have noticed it. You have, perhaps, also noticed that Lord Ashwick is not merely a guest, but a friend to this family. It would be unsuitable for any member of the household staff to—" She let the sentence close on a significant silence rather than a word. "There are things that cannot be undone, once one has overstepped." "I understand, Mrs. Holt." "A girl with nothing," Mrs. Holt said almost pleasantly. does well to guard what little she has." She moved on. Nora stood with the linens against her chest until the sound of footsteps diminished, then continued down the corridor, her face as neutral as the plaster walls. A girl with nothing. She had heard some version of it at every post since Ipswich. She had learned to take it as one takes cold rain, not without discomfort, only without surprise. What she had not learned was what to do when the words were demonstrably, specifically wrong. She was not nothing. She was a woman of 22 with a reader's memory, a competence her employers relied on without crediting, and a quiet courage that no one in 3 years of service had thought to notice. She had once sat with Lord Harwell's elderly mother through a night when the old woman's pain was severe and the prescribed cordial was insufficient, and she had done it without being asked, and she had read aloud from Scott until the old woman slept, and she had never once told anyone she had done it, because it had not occurred to her that it was worth noting. She had simply done it. Someone had seen her do it. She had not known that either. The fortnight's last evening was the occasion of a small dinner party, 8 guests in addition to the household, a modest affair by the standards of the season, but elaborate enough that all the household staff were pressed into service for the duration. Nora had been assigned to the room adjacent to the drawing room, where the extra glassware was kept, and she spent the first hour of the evening moving between the rooms with the composed attention of someone who had done this many times and expected to continue doing it indefinitely. She was in the corridor outside the drawing room when she heard her name. Not Vane. Not the housemaid. Her first name stated in the Earl's voice, with the careful specificity of a word he had been carrying for some days and had decided to set down in the presence of another person. She stopped walking. She could not see through a closed door. She could hear through it clearly enough, because the door was old and its fit imprecise, and sound carried through the gap. "Miss Eleanor Vane," the Earl said. "She is here, among the domestic staff. I am aware of who is among my brother's domestic staff." Mrs. Holt's voice was pleasant and cool. "Has she troubled you in some way?" "She has not. She was, before her situation, a woman of some standing. A solicitor's daughter. She held a position in Lord Harwell's household before she came here." A small silence. "I did not know that." "I imagine you did not." "She does not advertise it." Another silence, different in quality from the first. "I had occasion to visit Lord Harwell's household 18 months ago, on a matter of business. I was told certain things by certain people, and on the basis of what I was told, I advised Lord Harwell's heir that the arrangement was unsuitable." "I see," Mrs. Holt said. "What I was told," the Earl said slowly, as though each word had weight he was accounting for, "was not accurate." Nora's hand was flat against the corridor wall. She was not breathing quite normally. The reference that was provided for her was written to be useless rather than informative. I did not know that at the time. I know it now, because I have made inquiry. The quality of his voice had changed by a fraction. Not softer exactly, only more deliberate. The way a man speaks when he is holding himself to a standard of precision he has decided he cannot let fall. I gave advice on the basis of what I believed, and what I believed was constructed by someone whose interests it served. She was removed from a position she held competently. On my word. I do not see what you wish me to do with this information, Mrs. Holt said. I do not require you to do anything with it, he said. I wish to say it to someone. Nora pressed her palm flat against the plaster. The corridor was cold and dim, and somewhere behind her, a footman was carrying a decanter. And somewhere ahead, the sound of conversation from the drawing room was a low, continuous hum, and she stood between these things in the particular stillness of a woman who has just heard the account she has been carrying recalculated in her presence by the man who wrote it. He had not seen her. He did not know she had heard. She moved back to the glassware room and stood there for 4 minutes without touching anything. And then she went back to work, because there was nothing else to do. And because a woman who has been surviving by dignity does not stop surviving, simply because something has shifted. The dinner proceeded. The courses were cleared. The guests spoke about hunting and about Parliament and about a cousin of Lord Aldermere's who had married unsuitably in the autumn, and Nora moved through the room and did not look at the Earl, and the Earl, at his end of the table, ate his supper with the concentrated stillness of a man maintaining a position by effort. He looked at her once only, as she reached past the shoulder of the guest beside him to remove a dish. The look was brief and level, and held in it a quality she had no name for, something between accountability and intention. Not a request for forgiveness, not the performance of remorse, only a man looking directly at what he had done and not looking away from it. She kept her face composed and moved to the sideboard. Holt watched the exchange from across the table, and the watching told Nora that the information was now in circulation, that nothing that had been said in the drawing room would remain solely between its speakers, and that the morning would bring consequences she could not yet map. The morning brought Lord Aldermere. He came to find her in the housekeeper's room at 9 o'clock, where she was compiling the weekly linen inventory with Mrs. Gage, and he asked Mrs. Gage to excuse them, and he sat down in the chair that was ordinarily Mrs. Gage's, and looked at Nora with the slightly uncomfortable expression of a man who has been handed a situation by his sister and does not know whether to hold it or set it down. "Vane," he said, "I am told that Lord Ashwick has expressed concern about the manner of your previous employment." "I know nothing of Lord Ashwick's concerns, my lord." "He has spoken to me this morning," Lord Aldermere said, "and what he said was this. The reference you were given by Lord Harwell's household was, in his view, deliberately insufficient, and that he played a role in its being so, and that the role he played was based on information he now believes to have been false." She was quiet. He looked at her steadily, with the particular curiosity of a man seeing something he had previously had no reason to see. "He has asked whether a more accurate letter of reference might be of service to you," Lord Aldermere said, from himself, under his own name. The room was very still. Through the window, the kitchen garden was white with the week's frost, and a blackbird was doing something industrious in the bare stem of what would be, by spring, a gooseberry cane. "My lord," Nora said carefully, "I do not require." She stopped. "He is not asking whether you require it," Lord Aldermere said. "He is asking whether it would be useful to you." A pause. "I suspect it would be significantly useful. A letter from the Earl of Ashwick opens rather more doors than my household's reference." She did not speak. "The letter has already been written," Lord Aldermere said. "He gave it to me this morning. Whether it is given to you, or whether it is placed in the fire, is, I am told, entirely at your discretion." He set an envelope on the table between them. "I have been asked to leave you alone with that decision." He rose, inclined his head, and left. Nora sat for a long time looking at the envelope. The wax seal was the Earl of Ashwick's. The script on the front said only Miss E. Vane, and the handwriting was a man's, precise and unhurried, and she had heard enough of that precision in the past fortnight to place it correctly. She did not open it immediately. She sat with it and turned it over once in her hands, and felt the weight of paper that had been written with care rather than with convenience. And she thought about 18 months, and about the night in Lord Harwell's household when she had read aloud until an old woman slept, and about the fact that no one had known she had done it, except, apparently, one person. She opened the envelope. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first established her name and situation. The second described, in specific and unambiguous terms, her competence, her character, and her conduct during her time at Lord Harwell's household, citing precise examples she had never mentioned to anyone: the reading beside a sick woman's bed at 4 a.m, the management of a difficult situation with a visiting relative that had been resolved without incident, the patience with which she had attended to work that was below her education and above what she had been paid. The third paragraph was short. "I am aware," it said, "that this letter arrives later than it should have done, and that the interval it addresses was not without cost to its recipient. I offer it not as restitution, which is beyond the scope of paper, but as a correction of the record, which is within my power to make." The letter was signed. A full name, a title, the date. Nora sat for a long time after she had finished reading, not with any performance of emotion, not with the weight of something breaking or resolving, only with the particular quality of quiet that settles when something that has been wrong for a long time is named correctly at last. She folded the letter. She placed it back in the envelope. She put the envelope in the pocket of her apron against her chest. She went to find the Earl. He was in the entrance hall, preparing to depart. His traveling case was being loaded by 2 footmen, and his greatcoat was already on, and he was speaking to Lord Aldermere in the low tones of a conversation about to conclude. He saw her come through the corridor, and his conversation with Lord Aldermere did not stop immediately, but his attention divided, and when the conversation ended naturally, he waited where he was, and she came to stand before him, and the footman moved away to attend to the luggage, and they were as private as 2 people can be in an entrance hall. "My lord," she said. He said nothing. He looked at her with the same steady gray attention he had given her across a library and across a supper table, and this time he did not look away. "I was in the corridor," she said. "Last evening. I heard what you said to Mrs. Holt." He had known, she thought. The slight shift in his shoulders told her he had considered the possibility. He still did not speak. "I have read your letter," she said. She did not take it out. She kept her hand flat against her apron, against the shape of it through the fabric. "It is accurate in its particulars. I will be glad of it. I am glad it is of use to you," he said. Each word level. "I did not come to thank you," she said. "I wanted to say that I know what it costs to write it." She looked at him directly, because he had looked at her directly, and she had decided that directness was what this moment called for, and she was not going to give him anything less than the truth of it. "The woman you asked about at Lord Harwell's household, the one who gave you false information. She was Lord Harwell's nephew's intended, and she had decided I was in the way. I did not know who she had spoken to until now." A breath. "I am not saying this to assign blame. I am saying it because you asked your question without having the full account, and now you do." He was very still. "You acted in good faith on bad information," she said. "I know that is what happened. I wanted to say that I know it, so that we are clear." "Miss Vane," he said. Her first name, in his voice, the way she had heard it through a door, and then not heard it for the hours since, landed with an almost physical weight. She kept her posture level. "Nothing you have said changes what I owe you," he said. "Good faith built on false premises is still, in its effect, injustice. I am aware of that. Nevertheless," she said, "it changes what I feel about it." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that she could not fully read. Not guilt, which had been there before and was familiar to her, but something older and more careful. The look of a man who has been carrying a specific stone and has just understood that he can set it down. Only he is not certain the other person is strong enough for him to give it to them. "I am leaving for York this morning," he said. "Yes, my lord. I know. Lord Aldermere has spoken well of your situation here." She said nothing. "If you should wish," he said slowly, "for another kind of situation, when next I return to this part of the county." He stopped. He looked at the stone flags of the entrance hall. He looked back at her. "I am not certain what I am asking," he said. And the words had the quality of something rare, a man of his precision admitting to the boundary of his own precision. "I am asking it anyway." Nora stood very still. She thought about an entrance hall in Suffolk, 18 months ago. She thought about a voice that had not known she was there. She thought about 14 months in a cold servant's wing, and a library she had read in by permission she had not officially sought, and a letter folded against her heart. "I am asking it anyway," was the most honest thing a man of his station could have said. "I will still be here," she said, "when you return." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he inclined his head with the formal precision of a man who has learned that some things can only be begun, not concluded, in an entrance hall in November, and he put on his hat, and he walked through the door. Nora stood in the entrance hall as the carriage pulled away on the frozen gravel, and she listened to the sound of it diminish toward the road, and she put her hand flat against the front of her apron, against the weight of the letter. She did not know what would come of a question asked and not concluded. She knew only that it had been asked genuinely, with none of the social machinery that made questions into instruments, and that she had answered it genuinely, which was all a woman who had been living by her word could offer. The winter settled more deeply over Thornfield House in the weeks that followed. The kitchen garden turned entirely to frost. The library fire was kept better stocked than it had been, and Mrs. Gage did not remark on it. And Nora did not remark on it either. Lord Aldermere's daughters came down from the schoolroom on the weeks when their governess was visiting her mother in Bath, and Nora helped them with their French verbs and their watercolors in the evenings because their father could not, and because no one told her she should not. The elder daughter, a girl of 12 called Matilda, asked her once, in the way children ask things, "Were you a lady before?" "My father was a gentleman," Nora said. "What happened?" "He died," she said. "And then I worked." Matilda considered this with the seriousness children bring to facts their world has not yet complicated. "Did you mind?" "Yes," Nora said. And then I minded less. She was not sure when she had started minding less. She thought it might have had something to do with a letter that said her name correctly and described specific things she had done without being asked. She thought it might have had something to do with gray eyes that did not look away. She was not certain that she had permission to think too carefully about the gray eyes, but she found in the privacy of her room in the evenings that she thought about them anyway. He returned in February. She was in the kitchen garden in the early morning when the carriage arrived, pulling on her coat against the cold, going to cut whatever hardy herbs survived the winter for the cook's use. She heard the wheels, the familiar crack of a well-maintained carriage on the stone drive, and she did not go to look, because that was not her function, and because she had decided in the months since November that she would not arrange herself around the possibility of him. She cut her herbs and went back to the kitchen. He found her there. He did not walk into the kitchen as a guest would walk, as though the space were his by right. He appeared in the doorway with the hesitation of a man who has considered whether he has the standing for this, and decided the question is beside the point. The cook looked up from her pastry. The kitchen maid looked up from her copper. And then, reading the quality of the Earl's attention, they both found reasons to be elsewhere. Nora set down her basket. "Miss Vane," he said. He had come directly from the carriage. His coat was still on, his cravat slightly loosened by the journey, and he looked like a man who had traveled farther than the distance from York and arrived at the same conclusion the whole way. "My lord," she said, "I have something further to ask you." He moved into the room. He stopped 2 arms' lengths away, which was the correct distance. And also, she had come to understand, the distance at which he stood when he was holding himself carefully. "I told you in November that I did not know what I was asking. I have had some months to understand it more clearly." She waited. "I am asking," he said with the precision of a man who has rehearsed exactness and arrived at the simplest form of it, "whether you will do me the honor of allowing me to call on you properly, with Lord Aldermere's knowledge, and with his permission, and with the intention of making an offer when you have had time enough to be confident of your own mind." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire ticked in the grate. "You understand the difference in our situations," he said. "I am not asking you to set that aside. I am asking whether, given the difference, you are willing to let me try to be worth your consideration." Nora looked at him. She had been practicing, she thought, for this answer for 18 months without knowing that was what she was doing. She had been practicing it in servants' corridors and sculleries and cold rooms. In the afternoons she had read aloud to a woman who needed company. And in the mornings she had laid fires in rooms where she was not expected to have thoughts. "I am willing," she said. He let out a slow breath, and in the exhale she saw, for the first time, the edge of something that was not composure. A man whose stillness had been costing him something, he was now, briefly, allowed to put down. "Then I will speak to Lord Aldermere this afternoon," he said. She nodded. He inclined his head, turned, and left. She heard his steps cross the stone passage and ascend toward the entrance hall. She picked up her herb basket and looked at the fire in the grate, and let herself, for a moment, hold what had just happened as plainly as it was. A man had asked to call on her in the kitchen in February, having traveled from York to do it, and had asked with the specific honesty of someone who had spent several months looking squarely at what he owed and deciding to owe more. She was not romantic about it. She was, in the way of women who have survived on their own resources, careful and exact. She did not know yet what would come next. She knew only that she had been asked honestly, and that she had answered honestly, and that the answer had cost her nothing. That, she thought, was not a small thing. The weeks that followed were, by the standards of Regency social machinery, quiet. The Earl called on her 4 times before spring, each visit arranged with Lord Aldermere's full knowledge and conducted with complete propriety in the library that had long since become a room she thought of as half her own. They spoke of books, which they both read. They spoke of the county, which he knew better than she did, and of Ipswich, which she knew better than he did. They spoke once about her father, and once more carefully about the circumstances of her position, and once about a subject she would not have thought to raise with any man, which was whether a woman who had spent 3 years learning to manage on nothing was well positioned to be trusted with something. "Yes," he said, without hesitation, when she posed it. She had expected qualification. The directness of it stopped her. "I have been watching you manage for rather longer than you know," he said, "since before November." And then, with the particular quality that she had come to understand as his version of difficulty. "There was a woman I was close to, some years ago. A woman I made promises to. She did not live to see them kept. He looked at the window. Outside, the kitchen garden was beginning to show the first green of the season. I have been, since then, very careful about what I ask of people. And now, she said. Now, he said, I find that I am willing to be less careful. She sat very still with that for a moment. The offer was made in April, formally, in Lord Aldermere's presence, with the paperwork in Lord Aldermere's hands and a solicitor's letter already prepared, because the Earl was a thorough man who had been thinking about this since February, and possibly since November. Nora accepted it in the same way she had come to accept most important things, with composure on the outside and a slight internal sensation of the ground rearranging itself under her feet into something more solid than it had been. The engagement was announced at a small dinner at Thornfield in the first week of May, and Mrs. Holt was present. She was present with the particular dignity of a woman who has been required to revise an assessment, and is doing so without acknowledging the revision, her congratulations perfectly pitched, and her eyes once, briefly, meeting Nora's with something that was closer to recognition than the acknowledgment she would not quite give. Nora smiled at her, quietly, and moved to speak with one of the other guests, because she did not need the acknowledgment, and she would not embarrass a woman who was doing her best with what she had. A girl with nothing. She had heard it. She had lived by it. She was done with it now. By the end of summer, she was Eleanor, Countess of Ashwick, living in a house in Yorkshire that had more rooms than she had yet counted, and a library she had been given formal and complete authority over on the morning they arrived, which meant more to her than the title. The herb basket from Thornfield's kitchen garden she had brought with her in her traveling case, pressed flat, a few dried stalks of rosemary, and one winter-hardy sage still legible in the weave. She had not told anyone she had brought it. She set it on the windowsill of the library the first evening, in the low amber light coming off the hills, and she was still looking at it when he came to stand in the doorway. "What is that?" he said. "Thornfield's garden," she said. "What survived?" He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her, and in the gray eyes that had been watching her for longer than she had known, she saw, quietly and without ceremony, that he understood exactly what she meant. He crossed the room and stood beside her at the window, and they looked out together at the hills going dark in the late summer dusk, and the basket of dried herbs sat between them on the sill, small and plain, and entirely sufficient. If her story moved you, leave a thought below. Some things that survived deserve to be named.